Welcome everyone. My name is Faulkner. I'm the online event coordinator for staff development for educators. And I'd like to thank you for joining us today for the eight mathematical practices addressing the higher standards, grades K through 2 with Shannon Samulski. Before we start, there are a few things you should know. To allow for Shannon to be heard clearly, we have placed all attendees on mute. Please use the window on the right-hand side of your screen throughout the webinar to ask any questions. These will be used for our Q&A period at the end of the presentation. The session is being recorded, and assuming no technical difficulties, you will receive a link to the archive within 48 hours, as well as a link to a certificate of participation. Finally, at the end of today's presentation, you will receive a short survey, and by completing the survey, you do assist us in providing future complimentary webinars. Now, a little bit about SDE. At SDE, we believe educators have the most important job in the world, and it's why our mission is to empower pre-K through 12 educators across the country with sustained professional development solutions that are not only research-based and rigorous, but also practical, innovative, and fun. Our goal is to help you create environments that prepare your students for the evolving demands of the 21st century. Together, we can create extraordinary classrooms. We're pleased to have Shannon Samulski joining us for today's webinar. Shannon is a respected educational consultant, special education teacher, and founder of Strategic Intervention Solutions. She's well known for her practical, ready-to-use strategies and enthusiastic speaking style, and draws from many years of experience using response to intervention, data-driven instruction, and differentiation to ensure students learn and succeed. Her passion for the Common Core and deep understanding of Common Core math shines through in her confidence-building, upbeat, and idea-packed trainings. Welcome, Shannon. At this point, I'm going to turn the presentation over to you.
Good afternoon. Hope everyone's doing well. We're going to have a good webinar on the 8 mathematical practices and try and condense it into our webinar, but I also do a longer presentation on this, so I've kind of condensed some of the pieces for you to get a basic understanding of the 8 mathematical practices in really an early elementary level. So when we look at the 8 math practices, I kind of look at what I think of the Common Core as a whole. Many districts that I go to, they really know a lot about this top bubble, which is the Common Core state standards. They're very good at knowing what things you used to teach in your normal state standards and how they've changed the Common Core. And so a lot of people feel really confident about what they're supposed to teach. You know, that no longer in kindergarten, maybe, let's say in Michigan, we're not teaching patterning anymore in the way that we were. It's more integrated in the 8 math practices. Maybe in, first grade and second grade, you're looking at what used to be taught with time and money has changed. And so the part of that is just the Common Core state standards. Another entity of the Common Core state standards that I think a lot of people don't fully understand is the 8 mathematical practices and how they play an integral part in teaching the Common Core state standards. We shouldn't really be teaching any of the standards for our grade without doing it in conjunction with the 8 mathematical practices. When you look at the third bubble on the left, performance tasks, or sometimes known as rich math tasks, are really tasks that students should be able to perform independently, and you should do a lot of practice with them in your classroom. They are basically the execution of the 8 mathematical practices being taught well with the Common Core state standards. So you kind of see the Common Core with these 3 blue bubbles, and I kind of have this outer green bubble, which really means what all of this means, which is really the next generation assessment. So whether your state is doing the PARCC assessment, the SBAC assessment, Inspire, all of those types of assessments are considered next generation assessments, and they'll be assessing children on their knowledge of the 8 mathematical practices within performance tasks. They'll be looking at communicated reasoning and problem solving and concepts and procedures. So it'll be very different, at least for what we've been used to looking at in some of our tests. This bottom bar is numeracy development. I do a lot of training within numeracy development because really all of these bubbles on top would fall for a child if they don't have the basic foundation for a numeracy development. So what we're going to do at the beginning is just to get to know you a little bit, and we're going to do an interactive survey. I call it the fist of 5 when I actually get to see your hands. So today we're just going to really be clicking the options of which one fits you best as an educator. So thinking of these bubbles and where you stand and where your knowledge is right now as a K-2 teacher, or whatever grade you might teach, or if you're a principal, where you think your staff is. A fist of 1, or selecting 1, means that you really understand the content of what you teach in math, and that you're really understanding what you have to do for your domain in your grade. So if you teach first grade, you're really confident in what it is you have to teach. You would rate yourself as a 1. A fist of 2 would mean that I understand what I'm supposed to teach in math, and you always use the 8 math practices within each of your lessons so that you're not teaching anything in your math without using the math practices. A fist of 3, or rating yourself as the third option, would mean that you're doing all of those things, plus you're using performance tasks to assess your students' mathematical reasoning and their communicated reasoning, and it's something that you use to help reflect on your teaching. The fist of 4 would mean that you're doing all of the above, plus you feel really confident in your knowledge and execution of the Common Core standards as it relates to the next generation assessment. So you would be familiar with the claims on those assessments and what they look like. And if you were a 5, rating yourself as feeling confident in all of this, you understand how performance tasks, 8 math practices, the Common Core state standards, the next generation assessment all make sense to you, and you understand how numeracy is embedded throughout. You would mark yourself as a 5, or having the highest score on that. So if you could take a second, Faulkner will do the survey.
All right, looks like we've got getting close to the end of everybody voting. I'll give everybody about another 10 seconds here to jump in. All right. So by and far and away, 75% were considered themselves number 1, Shannon.
Okay, fist of 1.
Mm-hmm. And understand what they should teach within the standards and the grade. The next highest one, 14%, were fist of 3. All of the above, and using performance tasks to assess and reflect. And number 2 was at 9%. 9% feel good about the Common Core and using the 8 mathematical practices in their lessons. 2% were fist of 5. So 2% feel very confident, and nobody was voted for fist of 4.
Okay, that gives me just kind of a good option where most of our audience is. So a lot of you are really familiar with what you have to teach for your grade, and I feel like that's the hard thing, is that we look at the 8 math practices, and when I look in K-2 classrooms, or really K-5 or pre-K-5, we haven't heard about what the actual rigor is of the Common Core. And so I think of, the actual standards that you have to teach, that's really we're no longer going a mile long. We're not going to try to surfacely teach concepts in math and blaze through a curriculum as fast as we can. And as teachers, we feel that there's this abundance amount of pressure put on us to get through standards as fast as we can. And really the Common Core is not really saying that. It's saying that we're using these 8 mathematical practices, which are really providing more of a rigor of it, but more within their mathematical reasoning. And there's a really big paradigm shift that needs to happen among teaching for us to be able to meet the standards of the way they're thinking of it. And even if you completely substitute the word Common Core, but just using the reasoning that's behind the 8 math practices is just best practice in math. And so, the idea of this is that these standards are not intended to be new names on old ways of doing business. It's really that next step of, not just saying we're not teaching this now, but now I'm teaching this for whatever grade I'm teaching. It's about teaching it no longer a mile long, but a mile deep, that we have to take the concepts that we're teaching and be able to get it to the point where a child can do a performance task, and having us as teaching to stop teaching by telling, but to teach by showing. So get out of that concept of teaching kids procedures and concepts they don't understand. So initially, for myself being an elementary educator, looking at the 8 math practices, I honestly looked at those 8 math practices and I thought, that's great. I said, I don't, have to do anything with making sense of problems and perseverance solving them, or looking for and expressing regularity and repeated reasoning, because quite honestly, that's like another language and I don't even know what it means in an elementary framework. And so I've spent a lot of time with the schools that I work with really trying to break this down and to make it student friendly. And so this is a poster from my county that's on my website, and you can also search it through resa.net. On my website I have a link to it, but it's really taking the practices. When I looked at this poster and I thought, really, I don't know what to do with that, at an elementary level, but really what do those practices mean? So what I want you to do is I want you to think of, I'm a reading specialist first, and we're mostly reading people first in elementary school. So You're going to think of the strategies that you teach your kids for reading. You teach them to get their lips ready. You teach them to look at the pictures. You help them get their, you help them to reread. You use lots of strategies to help get your kids to learn how to read. You also use great strategies to help your kids learn how to write. You use 6 traits plus 1. You're looking at evaluating children's writing, and you're trying to improve on those areas. And so I want you to think of the 8 math practices in elementary school as the 8 ways, or the 8 best strategies that we're going to help instill in our children to help them have a better outcome or a more in-depth understanding of the concepts that we're trying to teach. And so what I'll do is within the time that we'll have, we'll break down these practices and kind of make them make more sense, and what do they look like in a real classroom, and actually using it on a daily basis. One of the questions to kind of think of is, when I think of trying to implement the 8 math practices, a lot of the schools that I go to, children are really weak in this area because more and more of our kids come to school with limited mathematical reasoning skills because they're not at home doing hands-on experience. They're not playing a game like Sorry and drawing an 11, and most kids would say, I'm going to move 11 spots. They don't see the reasoning and why it would be better to switch places with the partner that you're playing instead of moving the 11 spaces, because you could get closer to your home. A lot of kids, in the same concept in the game of Trouble, they don't play games that are hands-on, which really require you to take mathematical responsibility for your own thinking. A lot of kids, because they're so plugged in, a lot of the electronics and things that they have really prevent them from needing to use their own thought process. Many of our kids are very entitled, and there's a lot of what I kind of call helicopter parents that are there, doing everything for their child, still getting them dressed in kindergarten, still zipping their coat, still trying to come into the classroom when the child should be doing that on their own. So ultimately, the 21st century learner in the United States, I think, is really weak in being able to implement the 8 math practices because themselves have not been required to really do things in the depth that's needed. And so one of the ways that I do this in a lot of the schools I work with is through strategy games. A lot of times I do a lot with Math Workshop and getting out of that one-size-fits-all way of teaching math and trying to replicate what we do in reading. And so a game that I play with a lot of classes, and I have a strategy game CD that has about 14 or 15 games that use 7, if not 8 of the math practices. So if you're new to the math practices and understanding them, which it sounds like a lot of you are based on our poll, I would start off with something easy, like just doing strategy games that would help kids use mathematical thinking. And so one of the games that's featured in my strategy game CD is called Rotten Apple, and the kids know in the workshop that it's a 2-player game, and I'll talk later about the math salad bar, but the kids go up to the math salad bar and they would grab out a handful of chips, and they need 13 chips to be able to play that game. And so during this game, what I'm going to do is I'm going to switch over to a hover cam to kind of show you the way you play it. So this game here is 13 chips. For younger kids, I will have red chips and then yellow chips. So the red chips are chips that are, not the rotten apple. The yellow one itself is a rotten apple. And so as we're playing this game, you can take 1, 2, or 3 chips when it's your turn. And so I don't really have a friend here to play with, but I'm going to kind of act the game out for you. So it would be my turn. I can pick 1, 2, or 3 chips. At the end of the game, you don't want to get the rotten apple. You don't want this one to be, you want that to go to your partner. So if it was my turn first, I could choose to pick 2 chips. And if my partner picked, maybe they decide to take 2 chips, another partner would go ahead and they might think to play, take 1 chip. So as we're looking at the remainder of the chips, we're trying to strategically get kids to think about, how could I not be stuck with the rotten apple? And so, so as we're going through the game, I would take 1 more chip, and the other person would take another chip. At the end of the game, here we have 6 chips left, and so we might want to take 1 chip, so the partner now is stuck with either taking, if my partner takes 1, I'm going to take 3, and they're going to lose. If my partner takes 2, they're going to take 2, and I'm going to lose. If my partner takes 3, there's 1 left, and I'm still going to lose. And so with the game with Rotten Apple, if I were to pull 1, my partner would throw 3, and I would end up losing the game. And so the kids play a game like Rotten Apple over again, and they get the idea of how to how to play the game, but they're ultimately at the end trying to figure out how they could not have that rotten apple. At the beginning of playing a strategy game, many kids don't see the strategy that's involved in it, and so they are playing the game several different times to get the idea of how you would win at that game of rotten apple. So the game Rotten Apple, again, is just played with 13 chips, and it's helping kids to kind of look at their thought process within those math practices. Okay, as we continue, let's think about, just from playing that game, Rotten Apple, which of the 8 math practices were we using? In this particular game, kids had to make sense of the problem and persevere in solving it. They had to reason abstractly and quantitatively. They had to think about how many chips were left when it was their turn versus not. They could, in this game, construct viable arguments and critique the reasoning of others because they could talk about how many chips they took and why they took that quantity of chips. They could model with mathematics by showing their thinking as they're modeling with those chips. They have to attend to precision because they only can take 1, 2, or 3 chips. They have to look at the structure of what's left in those chips or the pattern of how many chips are left to decide how to win. So in a lot of the strategy games that we play, even in a workshop mode, would help you start to get kids to start to critique or think of reasoning on their own as they go. So the first practice we're going to look at, I'm going to kind of take each practice and talk a little bit about them and give you some live examples of what it would look like in a K-2 classroom. And many of these things, it looks very similar in the 3-5 classrooms in a lot of the trainings I do, but it's just broken apart in a little different way. So the first one is Math Practice 1, make sense of problems and persevere in solving them. On the side here I have just some kid-friendly posters that I have for free on my website that you're welcome to download. It just says I can try many times to understand and solve the problem. Basically, the first math practice in English or in normal terms, it just basically means that when you're presented with the problem, that you can make a plan, carry out the plan, and evaluate its success. So when we're thinking of that problem, I do this a lot with schools with trying to get them to use math work mats. In order to do this first practice, young kids need to act out things with objects and make mathematical conclusions about things that they're holding on to and trying to figure out, how to get to arrive at the solution that they're looking at. And so if this isn't on my website, I will be posting it onto my website for free. It's just a math work mat, and I usually put it in a clear plastic sleeve. Every child in the class gets a math work mat, and from the salad bar there's usually a bowl of chips. And so kids would work through story problems and having them act them out. So if I were to pose a story problem to the children, they would have to act the story problem out by putting the chips on their mat. A lot of K-2 children are used to seeing manipulatives, and then the manipulatives kind of go away, and we have the pencil paper format. The idea of using this practice at a young age is that we want kids first to be really good to act out what you're asking them to do in math concretely before we're asking them to do it abstractly. And so a child would have a math work mat, and they're able to use manipulatives and demonstrate kind of what they're thinking. So this is a problem that I posed to a class that I was doing some job embedded coaching with a couple weeks ago. And the problem was, it was actually a kindergarten classroom. The problem for this particular task was 6 children were going out to play in the snow. Each child had a red hat and blue boots. How many boots and how many hats? And so I had the kids obviously at the carpet area, and we were talking about, how many kids, if we had a friend up here and we looked at how many hats they have 1 hat on and they have 2 boots. If I brought another friend up, they would have 2 hats and there would be 4 boots. And then I brought a third child up to the class, in front of the class, and asked, now we have 3 children, how many hats do we have? And the kid said there was 3 hats. And another person said, well, there's 6 boots. And when I asked them, how do you know that there's 6 boots? And the little boy pointed to the feet of the children and he said, there's 2, 4, 6. And so I know there's 6 boots. And so we gave the kids kind of the idea of being presented with the problem, trying to come up with a solution, and then end up kind of executing it on their own. And so it was interesting to see what many of the kids did, as you can imagine. They went back to their table. We spent some time talking to them about how to represent a manipulative with a real-life object. So is our mat big enough to put boots on and hats on? No, it's not. It's not big enough to take everyone's boots and hats and put them on the table. Is there enough room for us to, actually cut out little hats and boots? Probably not. And so we ended up deciding that we were going to use chips, and the red chips would represent the hats, and the blue chips would represent the boots. And so we gave the kids an idea of what to look at. And so when we came over to this student, I asked the student, where are your hats and where are your boots? And she said, well, I have, I have 6 hats and 6 boots. And she couldn't really articulate what it was she had on her mat besides that, just on her mat, that this was hats and boots. And so it was interesting to see her interpretation of how she hears of a problem and tries to carry out, kind of carry out a plan. The next student we looked at actually was a student that was on the on the autism spectrum. He was yelling at me, Mrs. Samulski, I need more blue chips. And I said I assured him he had plenty of blue chips to make his boots. And at first the teacher and I looked at his mat and we thought, well, he really has no idea what he's doing. But in actuality, he did do a red hat and 2 boots, and he made little people out of his chips. So he had the arms, and he told me the kids were holding hands in between as they're walking out for recess. And so he did have some of the concept of the problem as he was acting it out, although he didn't arrive at the correct solution that we were looking for. Another student's representation of what we were asking was, there were 6. I said, how many hats do you have? 6. How many boots do you have? 6. I said, how many boots does a child wear? And the child said, well, a child wears 2 boots. And so I asked him, where are your boots? And he said, right here. So when we ask kids to do this math practice, their interpretation of what you're asking them to do, to be able to create a plan on their own, they're not really able to do that. They oftentimes don't understand. And so this boy, although he thought this one chip, the blue chip, was 2 boots, in actuality he was giving the incorrect answer. And we had some kids that clearly explained to me, Mrs. Samulski, these are my hats, these are my boots, there's a total of 6 hats, and I know there's a total of 12 boots. And so they knew and understood that problem. What we did for this one is we asked them to kind of evaluate their success and they showed me concretely, can they show me pictorially how that looks? And so many of the kids weren't sure how to draw a picture of their mathematical thinking. And so this girl here said, well, I'll just trace the chips, and so she started tracing the chips and kind of making, circles and writing down some numbers. This child, who appeared to understand it concretely, when he went to write the picture of how he understood it, he really didn't understand the task because he had too many boots and to too many hats. Over here he has 1 hat to 3 boots, and it just didn't make complete mathematical sense. Here this student, although his writing looks pretty chicken scratches, he did really make the model correctly, and he actually did do the correct number of hats and boots. He found there was 12 hats. He wrote out how he thought of it. So when we're thinking of this practice, the idea of giving a child a problem, having them try to act it out, see if the problem is right or wrong, we really need to give kids time to do that on their own. A lot of times we give story problems and we guide them through. I mean, I vividly remember standing up with the overhead or the hover cam or document camera and dragging kids in 2nd grade through a story problem. We would read the problem, and the kids either would take the 2 problems and the numbers they see and they add them together, or they take them away. They don't really understand what the story problem's asking, and we keep trying to highlight the words and try to explain it to them in a way that makes sense to them. But ultimately many of our kids are not unable to be posed a problem, come up with a plan on their own and actually execute that plan. So my thought is we really shouldn't be dragging kids through story problems anymore. This practice is really saying we need to relinquish the control of the children, have them become the source of mathematical ideas, and start to take responsibility for their own, for their own thinking and learning as they're going through this. The next math practice is looking at math practice 2, which is reason abstractly and quantitatively. This one is really that a child should be able to think about math problems in their head first. And so the best way that I think about this in a K-2 sense is that we're going to look at things in a contextualized and a decontextualized way. And so what that means in normal terms is that we're going to look at taking numbers and putting them into words, and taking words and putting them into numbers. And so actually a product that Crystal Springs has out that I really like using, that was written by Shar Forson and Tori Richards, is called Math Talk. It's not to be confused with Number Talk, but it's called Math Talk, and the book just has these really great pictures. And so if you were to pose your kindergarten, first, or second grade class this particular picture with the apples, a child would be given a number sentence, let's say, and they would have to talk out the words that would go out with that story. And so if the number sentence said something like, 8 minus 4, the children would have to come up with a story that would be relevant in that picture. So here we have on the tree, we have 4 apples and 4 apples that are eaten. And so a child might say there were 8 apples on the tree and Johnny ate 4 of them. How many were left? And so we're getting kids to auditorily develop their oral language skills to be able to do this practice. And the same thing in reverse is they might have a story problem and we want them to pull the words out, the numbers out. We do that more often with math problems by taking, reading a math problem, and they have to figure out, what the numbers are to go with it. This task is really looking at, giving kids numbers and then also being able to help them relate it to words, which is similar to what we were doing in the task with the hats and the boots as well. 8 Math Practice 3 has got to be one of the hardest ones to do with K-2 because kids don't have a reason as to why they can construct a viable argument, let alone critique the reasoning of others. Many kids just say when you ask them, how did you know the answer, or tell your friend how you knew it, many times they just say, I thunk it in my brain, and I just know it, Mrs. Samulski, because I'm so smart. I'll never forget a kindergarten student that I was working with said to me when I was showing her something, the answer actually was 5 to the problem we were doing, and she said, I know the answer, it's 5. And I asked her, I said, how do you know the answer? And she goes, I just know the answer because he told me the answer. And I said, oh, well, what did he say? What did he say the answer was? And he said, he said to me that the answer is 5 because 3 and 2 is 5. That's what he said. And I asked her, I said, well, you're really right on the answer and what you were told. I said, but who is he? And she said, well, he is my brain. And I said to her, why is your brain a male? It was just so cute that her thought process of who told her the answer was that it was her brain, and that it was a male. So the idea is to be able to construct viable arguments and critique the reasoning of others. And so we want kids to be able to come up with a plan and be able to, call it a strategy and be able to solve the problem and show it to other people, or maybe to be able to have a better way of showing the method than another friend might be. So in this practice, we're really trying to teach by having the students show you instead of explaining it. Traditionally in math, as we've learned it, I teach you, the teacher teaches you how to do it, you try and do it with me, and then I have you sit at your seat and do it traditionally. If you're truly using the 8 math practices, that way of teaching is not any longer going to work. It's not really I show you the procedure and you spit it back out, probably like how you and I learned math. I learned math. If I knew the procedure to get the math problem and the answer, I got it right. But if you ever asked me to apply my knowledge, I really didn't know what I was doing. And so in this math practice, we're really trying to get kids to not just learn the procedure, but to offer that there's lots of ways to get the answer to a problem. Yes, there's only one answer to a problem, but there's lots of different ways to get to that answer. And so this one's called Number Talks that I use from Sherry Parrish's work. There's it's a really great book. You can get it on Amazon. It's about $65, so it's pretty pricey, but it has a great DVD. I even think there's some YouTube videos on it. But modeling this with job-embedded coaching in the classroom has just been the most powerful experience for kids. For kids to be able to look at a problem. I was in a second grade classroom about 2 or 3 weeks ago, and we were working on this problem. I posed the problem 17 plus 16 on the board, and I wanted the kids to tell me how they got the answer. And a student said to me, I don't think the answer can be 213 because that doesn't make sense. But the way that I was thinking of it was that there is, technically 2 10s here. So I could think of this problem as 10 plus 10. And then I could think about 7 plus 6, that's 13. And so the child said to me, well, there's 20 and 13. That's kind of hard for me to add, so I might think of it as 20 plus 10 equals 30, and 30 plus 3 equals 33. And so the idea behind Number Talk was, the way I learned and the way you learned was we lined them up. We put the 17 on the top, put the 16 on the bottom. We went in the ones column. We added the 7 plus the 6, and we knew it was 13. And we would say we'd put the 3 down, and we carried the 1. And in our knowledge, we'd add 1, 1, and 1 and get 3. And so when we think of that, that is a traditional way of teaching algorithms. And we really shouldn't be teaching kids that way if we're trying to get them to construct viable arguments and critique the reasoning of others. Because ultimately, how can I construct viable arguments and critique your reasoning if you've done it in a very traditional way? And so we want kids to see that you can solve the problem 17 plus 16 in multiple ways. And if your district is taking the SBAC or the Smarter Balance or any of those types of tests, they're going to have to communicate their reasoning to be able to be successful. And so at a young age, at K-2, if our kids are not starting to get out these ideas or these ways that they're thinking of it, they're not going to be prepared for what they need to do. Math Practice 4 is one that is very fun to use, and I used it in the task that I showed you in the Practice 1, which is modeling with mathematics. And so in the kid-friendly poster that I have on my website, it says I can use math symbols and numbers to solve problems. What I want you to remember for this practice is that you want kids as many times as possible to solve problems in 3 to 5 ways. And so you might have children solve problems through symbolically, which we do with pencil and paper a lot. If you're having a child solve a problem on pencil and paper, you're assuming that they can draw a picture, that they understand what they're doing. And if they can draw a picture, you're assuming they could actually act it out with concrete objects. So when we think of what I call, the idea of CPA, concrete, pictorial, abstract, we want kids to be able to demonstrate their knowledge with mathematics through modeling through CPA, that they should be able to show you concretely, show you pictorially, and show you symbolically. And developmentally, that is really, abstractly, developmentally for K2, that really fits nicely into what we're doing. And so instead of solving the problem on paper, can you show me it in a way? Can you use oral language and written language to tell me how you got the answer, and can you relate it to real world situations? And so as we look at this practice, we want kids to really be able to act out concretely, pictorially, and abstractly. When you think of it as a kindergarten teacher, I want you just to think back to that math work mat that you just need to figure out in your kindergarten classroom. How can I pose problems to my kindergarten students and just give them the story and have them act it out? And so on my website, I have a few of these free story mats that I use. This says act it out. And so kids would be sitting in a mathematical experience at the rug area with their mat in front of them. I do everything in clear plastic sleeves. I don't like to laminate a lot of things. And so they would have, in a kindergarten classroom, they would have their story mat. And you might say, on the road there were 4 blue trucks and 2 red trucks. How many trucks altogether? And so what you want to see your kids doing is taking the Unifix cubes and putting 4 red trucks and 2 blue trucks in there, or cars, and trying to figure out how many in all. At the bottom here, you want them to get used to doing a quick draw. And so a quick draw, they can use dry erase marker if you're using it with the clear plastic sleeve, or if you actually have these as journal pages. How do you show your trucks in pictures? And so we're not really in kindergarten needing to focus with, modeling with mathematics with the numbers. I do a lot with subitizing and not really focusing on those digits, because ultimately kids don't really know what those mean. And so as we're acting out concretely, show me with your objects on the acted out math, and then can you show me how you draw it? If we can get kids to leave kindergarten doing this math practice, which really integrates almost all the 8 math practices, we're doing a really great job. In a first grade and a second grade classroom, we want to take it a step further when we're modeling with mathematics. We want kids to be able to act out story problems on my math work mat that I showed you in the previous slide. And then I want you to be able to show model drawings. I do a lot of trainings with the model drawings, but even in first grade, we might start off with just doing a quick draw on this side. Then on this side of the journal, can you show me your computation? Can you show me what you were thinking? Later in first grade, we want to start to get kids to start to explain their mathematical thinking. What was it that you were doing? So kind of bringing back in practice number 3, which is explain your math thoughts. First I put 6 blue chips on the mat. Next I put 3, red chips on the mat. And they're just kind of talking about how they're doing it. This journal template we've used with hundreds of teachers that I've been working with. It's for free on my website, where we just kind of glue the problem in the center here. They end up coming up with their complete sentence form. So, Sally has blank cookies all together, and then they end up doing their model drawing or their quick draw. they have their computation here, and they explain their mathematical thinking. And so in a second grade classroom, if we're doing this systemically in our school systems, kids will be used to hearing story problems, modeling with mathematics. And so they have the story mat in kindergarten. In first grade, they have my math work mat, and they're really working on getting, acting it out, doing a quick draw, and then doing some computation. And then really by second grade, kids should be able to, especially by January, should be able to complete this journaling by themselves. And so we need to stop doing story problems, on that overhead or the hover cam and dragging kids through every step, because ultimately when you're doing that, they're getting it while you're doing it, but you and I know when you turn around and have them do it on their own, they're not able to do it. And so the idea of the 8 math practices is that they're able to model with mathematics on their own. And so if you can shoot to do that 5 different ways with one problem, kids get used to starting to construct their own ideas and thought processes behind what it means to really model with mathematics and understand it. Another math practice is math practice 5, which is use appropriate tools strategically. And so in this one, we have got to have manipulatives in the classroom. K-2, we do a great job with it. A lot of 3-5 classrooms that I work with, we just end up trying to blaze through the book and we forget about, using hands-on objects. But if we're doing fractions and we're doing those higher level things, kids need to be able to have tools in their hand. And, a lot of what I do with a lot of my math kits that I sell are, they're really extrinsic type of manipulatives. A lot of the manipulatives that Crystal Springs sells with the place value chips and the place value strips and a lot of the 10 frame type things, those are what I call extrinsic manipulatives. They're not going to be, your typical unifix cubes, but things that will help kids draw mathematical thoughts around the manipulative. So using appropriate tools strategically, really means that we're gonna look at being able to use math tools, pictures, drawings, and objects to help us solve problems. So think about your classroom. Are you a center kind of a person where you put a tub out at every center and you have whatever chips you would need? So if we were going to play Rotten Apple, you would have a little cups with 13 chips counted out for all your kids. Or are you a person that has what I call a math salad bar, where you have a place in your classroom where kids can easily access manipulatives on their own? If kids can read to self and do all of those things with, listening to reading and all those things on their own, kids can get their own manipulatives on their own. And so what we have in a lot of the classrooms that I work with is a math salad bar, which is a centrally located place in the classroom, which is a cart. I have a cart example here. There's actually salad bowls on top because every manipulative in the classroom has to travel in a salad bowl because I can't have kids picking up chips and dice and they're falling all over the place. It's actually a job in the classroom to be in charge of the math salad bar to make sure all the things get back into the containers where they belong. But the idea is when you're doing math workshop that kids are, going to get their own manipulative. So if they're going to play a game like Rotten Apple, they're going to grab a salad bowl and they're going to grab the 2-sided chips out and they're going to take that to their station. This idea is that we want kids to be able to use tools strategically on their own without us doing it. So much instructional time is lost with passing out manipulatives and getting them where they need to be. I remember sitting and putting tubs and you'd have the tubs set out and then at lunch I'm picking up dice and chips from the floor because I have to reset the center tubs for the next rotation that's coming up tomorrow. Many times you go back and you do your guided math group and someone's saying, Mrs. Smith, I can't find the chip, and so they're responsible to go to the math salad bar. They know where the 2-sided chips are. They get them out. I usually do a double wide cart where I have actually a lot of my game boards for workshops, math workshop in there as well. But the idea is that, this is the kids' responsibility to go get the materials they need. Counting buddies, which is a math manipulative that I designed to help K-2 kids understand combinations to 20 and do different things with subitizing. There's counting buddies or Rec and Rex or Abacus or whatever it might need, the kids might need. It's always available to kids on the math salad bar. So they can go to the salad bar, they can get the manipulative that they need, and they can go back. And so the idea of this practice is that kids need to use appropriate tools strategically. It doesn't mean that obviously a child's not going to use, if they're measuring something, they're not going to use a 10 frame to do it. It doesn't mean that they're going to use the tool appropriately in the way that they're thinking of the right tool for the right problem, but they're able to use those and then ultimately be able to use those tools strategically. So, you think about this practice, how can you use an appropriate tool strategically without having anything in your hand. The idea behind this practice is that we want kids to be able to have those hands-on objects like a 10 frame or a counting buddy. You know, a child that uses a counting buddy over and over again gets the idea of seeing how many beads are on the counting buddy, and they might say 5 plus 8, counting buddy junior. It's because the child is subitizing or picturing that there's 5 beads on the top part of the buddy and 3 beads on the next part of it, and they're seeing that that is 8. And so I'll show you a picture of a counting buddy in a second. But the idea of that practice is that you want kids to be able to think of the hundreds chart, even though the hundreds chart's not there in front of them, or think of the abacus or think of the rec and rec and be able to solve problems when they're doing that. Math practice 6 is attend to precision. This really means that you can check and see if the strategies and calculations that you have come up with are correct. As you can see, the first math practice that I showed with the boots and hats really ribbons throughout all of these practices, because the example that I showed you is actually a performance task for kids, and that's really how I go about, using a lot of the 8 math practices. So what we want to do is we want to use precision while solving problems and help them communicate reasoning. This was in a first grade classroom, and this just gets you the idea of, how well do our kids really attend to precision. They two numbers in a story problem, they add them up. They, a lot of the kids have things on their math work mats that really are not precise, and they're not really thinking about what they're doing. And so if your kids are not doing it on pencil and paper, I always say to kind of peel back the layers of the onion and go back a layer to see if they can draw it. If they can't draw it, then see if they can act it out. So this particular problem that was posed says that Connor washed 20 wheels in a car wash. How many cars did he wash altogether? Some first grade teachers would say, oh geez, Shannon, that's like a division problem. But it's really not. Kids need to be able to be flexible with numbers. They need to understand what 20 is and understand how to manipulate the number 20 in multiple ways and still make sense of what that number means. So this one says Connor washed 20 wheels. So we talked about this math practice, this task, and we had kids go back to their table and they had to act it out. And of course there was pre-teaching of how many cars, how many wheels are on a car. We talked about there was 4. We actually had a car, a little mini car, and showed there was 4 wheels. We said if we had 2 cars, how many wheels would we have, washed? And the kids, got the idea of 8. Even though in the mini lesson kids completely understood that every car has 4 wheels and that we washed 20 wheels total, and that the task was we wanted to figure out how many cars we washed, many of the kids went back to their mat and had no idea. I mean, so the student on the right said to me, I got it. I took it and I divided it. I grabbed out 20 chips out of the bowl. I didn't lay out 20 chips for them. On their own, they have to attend to precision and figure out how many chips they need. They divided them into equal groups with 4, and the child said that they knew in this example that 5 cars were washed. When I went over to this student, I said, how many cars did you wash? And he said, well, Connor ended up washing 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. He washed 10 cars. And I said, well, how did he wash 10 cars? I said, how many wheels does a car have? And the boy said, well, every car has 4 wheels. And, we were thinking of the perception of what a first grader thinks of. This child, when they look at one side of the car, really, how many wheels do you see? You really only see 2 wheels. And I think his perception of that was that these were his cars with the 2 wheels, and so he got a completely different answer, just on his mathematical thinking. And so when we think of attending to precision, many of our kids are not precise enough in their thought processes to understand that. So we have to think about, does it make sense? And so slowing down your instruction a little bit of getting kids to be precise by I take all the time their math work mats and put them under the document camera and say, let's talk about this problem. Instead of me going behind this child and forcing him to put those chips into groups of 4. I can force that child to put those chips into groups of 4, but ultimately he's not understanding the task. And you can't, teach children by telling. You have to teach through their own self-discovery of them understanding it themselves. Math practice 7 is look for and make use of structure. And so this we do a lot in K-2. As you know, we're constantly using 10 frames or, different kinds of visual pictures for kids. And so what I want kids to be able to do with this is ultimately to be able to subitize, to be able to think of a problem like I was describing before when a child in a classroom yelled out, 8, it's because on the counting buddy moves in a macrame beaded way, so you can pull these beads down on the buddy. But the child saw 5 red beads and 3 white beads, and they've used this structure in their classroom for a long time. So when she said, "What is 5 plus 8?" she said 8, and the reason why she knew it was because of the counting buddy junior. And that's really great because a kid is using structure from an object that they've used to help them remember. And she said there's 5 red beads and 3 white beads and 2 left over off to the side for a total of 10. And so I do a lot. We would like another 6-hour workshop, but on numeracy development and really understanding it. And so I've developed 2 different screeners that we screen almost every school that I work with in K-2 on. One of them is really testing their subitizing skills and understanding number quantity. So they're looked, subitizing means instant recognition of number quantity, that you could look at a counting buddy with 7 on it and say 7, and you know it's 7 because there's 5 red beads and 2 white beads. Or might be able to look at a 5 frame or a 10 frame or dice or a plate. And so I've kind of created a screener that's on my website that we're screening a lot of kids and trying to get away from some of the common assessments that we're doing in math and really looking at where are kids' numeracy skills. We want kids to be able to subitize combinations like you can see on the left. That 8 is, not just the digit 8, that 8 actually means 6 and 2 more, or 9 means 5 and 4 more. And so another screener that I have is called Understanding Combinations and Missing Parts, and that basically, helps kids. You're trying to figure out how well do they really use structure to help them understand math. You'll be shocked after doing a lot of these screeners that many of our kids do not picture anything, and they don't have any sense of structure when they're thinking of math because it's very abstract to them, and they're just memorizing. And if you imagine a child touching their nose as they're adding 5 plus 2, right? The last one is probably a compilation of all 7 of the practices being done really well. It's look for and express regularity in repeated reasoning, and what that means in our K-2 terms is that you can use a strategy that you've used to solve another problem to help you solve this problem. So, for example, in K-2, that looks like, doubles plus 1, let's say. It might be making 10. So when I see a problem like 9 plus 6, this is using structure to help you understand that. I see 9 and 6 more. I fill the top frame, and I can see that the answer is 15. Being able to use related facts is this strategy that you know that 3 plus 5 equals 8, therefore 8 minus 5 equals 3. Thinking of number bonds or fact families, that really helps kids to kind of understand this. The commutative property for addition, that 3 plus 2 is equal to the same as 2 plus 3. So this one is really having kids apply, not shortcuts, but like, having math reasoning for why they would think of a math problem, but it's repeated reasoning. So some people get confused between practice 7 and practice 8. Practice 7 is structure. So think of a counting buddy or a rec and rec. It's actual spaces. 8 is more in numbers, like it's going to be with, like I said, doubles plus 1 or doubles take away 1. They're going to be thinking of it within the actual digit format. So this is a lot in a little bit of time, but even if you were one of the people that marked that you were A and you really only think of the Common Core as kind of that top bubble, which is just the standards, I hope through our webinar that you're able to understand that it's so much more than that, and there's such a paradigm shift that we have to make to be able to do what the Common Core is asking. And the reality is, in the spring of 2015, for many states, we're going to be taking this Smarter Balance or PARC or Inspire test, which is a next generation assessment, which is going to require kids not to fill out a sheet of subtraction problems with regrouping. It's going to have them, the second grade kids, that if you're a second grade teacher that you are right now, your kids will be taking that test next year, and they're going to have to complete a performance task on that test. They're going to have to communicate their reasoning, and they're going to have to be able to do problem solving and tell why they know. And if they're repeating a process or a procedure, that's not going to cut it. They're not going to be able to say, I regrouped to figure it out. They have to have more substance to what they're doing. So one great way is to look at those math strategy games like I showed Rotten Apple. I have a download on my website that you can get a 10% off coupon for a week if you type in the coupon code SDE webinar. I'll also put it on my blog site as well, but the shopping site is shop.strategicinterventionsolutions.org, and so you can check out that. You can also check out the Counting Buddies. The screeners are on there, and you can also get 10% off of those as well for the next week after the webinar. I'll have a direct link to that as you go. So just looking at all of this and thinking of where you are as a district and where you are as a just within your school even, or within the grades K-5, you really need to take a deep look at this and ask yourself, what kind of professional development are you getting, with this? And so one of the things I model my company after, and I do a ton of work with SDE with, is really that we need to go slow to go fast with our PD. There's a lot of great PDs out there, but the best way to integrate the Math Common Core is really through some modules that I've developed for SDE, is to really look at, how can I break apart professional development and stop getting a K-5 professional development that's 6 hours and taking less than 5% of it really and implementing it. How can we slow that down and go into grade bands and really get some good content of the 8 math practices, performance tasks, understanding numeracy development, and then from that, getting job embedded coaching. So a lot of my work, I do a training, and I don't give you another PD until job embedded coaching, where I'm coming to your classroom. I'm either going to do a cluster coaching where all the kindergarten teachers are going to meet together and we're going to do model lessons. I'll come and model performance tasks. You really need a hands-on look at this. I don't think it makes a lot of sense to hear about it as much as it does to see it. And so I do a lot with job embedded coaching, and SDE has a whole division of their company that we work with schools to help them do that. And so what I want you to do is, if you're doing a PD or planning a PD, I want you to ask yourself, are you giving systematic change, are you giving it time? And so I want you to think of the ratio of 1 PD day to 1 job embedded coaching day. If you're booking multiple PD days, are you really spending the money on something that is going to really affect systematic change, or are you just getting some other really great fun ideas that really don't have a approach or a connection to what we're doing? I'll be typing up a summary of this with some questions, and these are some of the resources. I'll cite those so you can see those again. And I'm going to turn it over to Faulkner. I thank you for all spending a little bit of time with me this evening, and hopefully your percentage of just feeling the A, you might be thinking that you might be a fist of 2 now a little bit.
Thanks, Shannon. Hope everybody enjoyed today's presentation. We're going to take a minute or two just right now to let you submit any last questions for Shannon via the window on the right-hand side of your screen. In the meantime, I'd like to mention a few things. As a thank you for attending today's webinar, we would like to offer you a 10% discount if you register for any seminar or conference by April 27th and mention VIP code W032714. So today's date, if you can remember today's date, you can remember the VIP code. In fact, you might be interested. Shannon is going to be at SDE's upcoming New England Conference for pre-K through 3rd grade educators next week in Manchester, New Hampshire. At her 2-day seminars on Common Core Math and the 8 mathematical practices. She's going to be in Nashville for April 9th and 10th, and Atlanta May 7th and 8th. Shannon's also going to be at our national conferences in New Orleans and Las Vegas this June and July. And we're also proud to say that she's going to be presenting this April at the National Council of Teachers of Mathematics at their 2014 annual meeting and exposition in New Orleans. I'd like you to keep in mind as well, you can bring Shannon on site, as she was speaking about, with customized training, embedded coaching, whatever it is that your school or district, whatever the unique needs are for your situation. For more information on training or to register for any SD event, give us a shout at 877-388-2054. You can also go online, sde.com/events. We'll get you more information as well. Please do follow us on social media. You can find us on Facebook, Twitter, and Pinterest. SDE for Educators using the number 4, and so Twitter, Facebook, Pinterest, LinkedIn, give us a search for Staff Development for Educators, and you'll receive more information on upcoming webinars and other events and things going on with us. And just to remind you, you will receive a follow-up email within 48 hours that will include a link to a printable certificate of participation for the webinar, as well as a link to the archived recording of the webinar. Now, I'd like to thank you for your patience on that little housekeeping that I have to do, and want to get to a couple of questions before we let Shannon go. Shannon, we did have a question from one person, and this actually hits a lot of your expertise, I would say. And someone asking, does the approach work much differently for students with learning disabilities? She said she has students with disabilities in auditory processing and oral expression.
Yeah, well, one of my degrees is in learning disabilities, so I do a lot with special education students and looking at, I do a lot of different kind of programs with that, and we've seen a lot of great success with kids having those hands-on experiences. And so a lot of times I really felt like as a special education teacher, in my early, parts of teaching, I was really big on if I could just teach them the procedure, they would end up getting it. Or if I teach them touch math, they're going to get it. And I do still use some of those strategies for kids that are a little bit older, but ultimately I realized, if I could take any concept that's being taught, if you're a second grade teacher and you have kids who are learning disabled, taking it down to a concrete level is so helpful for kids to be able to see what it looks like. Because when you're saying something like, whatever, 32 minus 14, they're not picturing anything at all. But if I could show that on an abacus and you could see it, or if I could, one of the standards is to be able to recognize, or to be able to, know sums to 20, addition and subtraction. Many of my kids with a counting buddy or something they can have in their hands, and they're seeing the 17 and they're adding the 4 more, they can get that idea of it. And so I've seen great success with Math Practice 7 with them, which is using structure to help them, whether they're doing fractions or whatever it is, to kind of get out of that procedural way of teaching and break it down, for all kids, at-risk kids, but, especially special ed kids, they don't have a picture for what you're asking them to do, and they can't transfer it. Just be careful not to do the manipulative and push the manipulative away and then bring the pencil paper. You got to do it together. So the math work mat is a really great option to have the manipulative in front of you while you're doing the pencil paper, so that it's not 2 separate tasks.
Thanks, Shannon. I had a couple of people ask about that VIP code for registering for events. It's W032714, and again, that would get you 10% off our upcoming events through the next month. That's good for. And I think we have time for a couple more. Mary asks, what are your thoughts on automatic recall of basic facts?
It's funny she asked that, because I am a big, I'll give you a good example. My daughter's teacher at the beginning of the school, and she taught when she taught first grade, love her first grade teacher, just a wonderful teacher. She said to me, I really want in first grade, on my standards, I'm teaching everyday math, it says they have to do math facts fast. And I said to her, okay. I said, well, let's, she said, I want to, she ended up telling the class, let's go on extramath.org and let's just push these math facts and get them going. And so I took my daughter Emma, and we went home, and I tried to put her on the computer, and I knew full well that she didn't understand combinations, and I was asking her to do algorithms, which is a concept that's very abstract that she didn't understand. And she sat at the computer and was literally crying by the time all of the math facts, ran through, and she had 3 or 4 of them right. And so I went back to her teacher and said, I'm wondering how many of the kids in your first grade class really understand combinations. And her teacher said, I'm not really sure, because in my standards it says they have to do the facts fast. And so rightfully so, she's doing her job just the way it says in the curriculum. But the curriculum itself, like everyday math or whatever it is you teach out of, is not the Bible. It's not, you have to look at best practice of where kids are. And so I actually screened her children on this screener, which was looking at the understanding combinations. And we basically took all of these cards, and I hid the 8, and I flashed them to them to see if the kids understood. Many of them were using their fingers to tap and count and try to figure it out. As a result, from the screener, we found out that 34% of her kids understood combinations, and only 34% of them actually understood missing parts. So if I were to cover up, on the 8, cover up the 6, and they're only seeing the 2, and I'm saying, I wish I had 8, but I only have 2. If you're understanding missing add-in, you should say 6. But our kids don't understand that when they see, 2 plus square equals 8. And so I asked myself, why are we pushing kids to memorize facts? It's a process or a procedure they don't understand. And so ultimately, we need to take a step back developmentally and see, do our kids even understand combinations and missing parts? And if they can't, if they don't have a picture for it, does it make sense to do that? Because I give them Mad Minute and I see that they don't know the fluency. I give it to them again, they don't know it, and so in my mathematical thoughts, there is a time and place for fluency, but ultimately many kids in first grade and second grade, they just don't have that concept yet. And so when kids are ready for fluency and they pass understanding combinations on the screener and they pass missing parts, then in my professional opinion, I feel like, yes, they are ready for it. And kids are, because that year I asked her to stop doing the Mad Minutes, and we put in a lot of different kinds of stations within her everyday math that focused on the kids understanding combinations. And I said to her, don't do any more mad minutes until March. I know you have to do them on your benchmarks, but let's just wait. And we waited to do it, and we did lots of different kinds of subitizing activities with combinations, with the counting buddies and different things. And come end of March, I tested her kids again. They had 94% accuracy on combinations and 94% accuracy on missing parts on my screener. And when they gave a mad minute, the kids for the first time, those were the kids that were saying 5 and 3, counting buddy junior, I know it's 8. And so it was for the first time in her career she saw that kids understood the combinations. They didn't just memorize it just to memorize it.
Thanks, Shannon. I think I've got one more quick one for you. Question, is the strategy game CD available for purchase?
Yep, you can get it as a download on the website. So if you go to Strategic Intervention Solutions, I think it's actually shopstrategicinterventionsolutions.org. You can go on there, and it's an instant download that you can do it. It comes with 14 or 15 games. All of the games will implement the 8 mathematical practices. I have my math workshop cards that go with the game, so they have these little headers, and then they also have these little rotation cards that I use actually with my math salad bar that goes to the other trainings that I do. But yep, you can download that, and the screener's on there. Some people get the screener tool pack, and so I can ship that to you also.
Thanks, Shannon. I think we should probably finish up. I do want to let everybody know if we didn't get to your question, we'll be posting the questions and answers along with the webinar archive on our site. And what I'm going to do at the end of this is I'll be sending Shannon her homework, and she'll answer the questions that we didn't get to along with written answers to the ones that we did. We'll be posting links to the Q&A and the webinar archive on Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn, all of our social media avenues. And we did have some people asking about the summer events and those. You can learn more about the summer events at sde.com/nationals, but you can also give us a call at the 800 number that is right here, 877-388-2054. We can answer any question about the Nationals or any of Shannon's upcoming events as well.
Yeah, come see me in Nashville, or in this whole thing is about what I'm doing in Nashville, the seminar run in Atlanta. If you're near that area, it's going to be a two days, make and take, just fun stuff. Part of it's the 8 math practices, but it's this whole idea, this paradigm shift that we have in front of us. And I'm actually doing a lot of sessions in. I think I'm going to be at I Teach K, I Teach First, Singapore Math, DI, and the New Orleans conference. That they're all chock full of different things that have to do with a lot of things I'm talking about here.
Excellent. All right. Thanks to Shannon for joining us today. We hope you enjoyed today's presentation, and I hope everybody has the great rest of their day. Goodbye, everybody.
Thanks. Take care.